Hello, everyone, and welcome to this cyber seminar. Thank you for joining us. This webinar series has been convened by AGU-H3S, the Hydrology Section Student Subcommittee, or the AGU Hydrology Student Section Subcommittee. This is a 5-part series occurring each week at this time this summer. This is number 2, and we're looking forward to having you join us. Previous Navigating Academic Waters webinar series hosted by AGU-H3S are available on the CUAHSI YouTube channel, and I'd encourage you to check those out if you're interested. And we're very glad to continue to collaborate with AGU-H3S on series like this one. And are very thankful for all of their hard work putting this together for the water science community. My name is Julia Masterman. I'm the Science Education and Outreach Coordinator with CUAHSI. CUAHSI is the consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science. And our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels through programs like this cyber seminar series. I'd encourage you to reach out to me, visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, or join our community Slack channel to learn more about what we do or to get involved. I'll put links for all of those sorts of things in the chat in just a moment. Also, the CUAHSI Biennial Colloquium will be occurring next week, starting on Monday. And today is the last day to register. So I'd encourage you to visit our website to get registered for the biennial. It's a great opportunity to connect with the CUAHSI community and water science community more broadly. And I hope to see you there. Before we get started, a few logistical things. This main session is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, later on in the session for the second hour, we will be breaking out into breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, and it will be at a different link. So we will be providing a link to join the breakout room meeting in the chat at the beginning and later on at the end of this first hour. Those breakout rooms will begin 1 hour from now. The link will be posted a number of times. You can also find the link to that meeting in the email that you received with the connection information to this webinar. So worst case scenario, if you get disconnected, you can find it there. Thank you again for joining us, and to AGU-H3S for putting together another fantastic cyber seminar series. And without further ado, I will pass things off to AGU-H3S member Deon Knights to introduce this session and panelists.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. My name is Deon Knights. I am an NSF postdoctoral fellow working at West Virginia University. I'm part of H3S, and I am going to be moderating the questions with our panel today. So I think we will have the panel introduce themselves. If we can, if you get the next slide with their names, that would be great. Oh, okay. Yeah, as Julia mentioned, we have our schedule that she talked in depth about, so we'll skip that for now. And I'll have the panelists introduce themselves in the order they appear on the screen, starting with Alejandro, name, affiliation, and whatever tidbits you need to add.
Hey everybody, my name is Alejandro Flores. I am an associate professor in the Department of Geosciences at Boise State University, and I am exceptionally happy to be here with you all today.
Hi everyone, I'm Christopher Russoniello. I'm a second-year assistant professor at West Virginia University, and I am in the Department of Geology and Geography, and I sort of do groundwater stuff. So I'm also really happy to be here with you all.
Hey all, Adam Ward, Associate Professor at Indiana University in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, surface water and groundwater hydrology, and have helped a number of people with statements over the years. So I'm excited to pass that along.
Hi, everyone. My name is Margaret Zimmer. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in the Earth and Planetary Sciences department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is an R1 institution. And I started here in my position in January 2018. So I was on the job market within the last 5 years, and I can speak from my experiences as a candidate for academic positions at teaching, R2, and R1 institutions.
Okay, thank you very much. So today's writing statements, as you all know, we have an hour in this first part, and we're going to break it down into like different categories. The first few minutes, we'll talk about general statement questions. Then we'll go into the DEI statements. The next 15 minutes, then after research statements and teaching statements. So if you have like a really important teaching statement question you want to ask, know that we'll be focusing on that section a little bit later. And just to the panelists, you guys feel free. You don't all need to answer the exact same question. If you feel like someone already thoroughly answered it, we have a bunch of questions, so we can keep it moving as much as possible. So I'll start off with the first one, pretty straightforward question. We're talking about general statements for the first 15 minutes. And to get us going, what are the useful resources for putting together different statements or application materials? And I'll just have whoever feels like answering, unmute yourself and answer.
I'll start and say that I think one of the most useful resources for me were the more senior graduate students and postdocs in my lab who had either recently applied or maybe had recently gotten positions. So using them as resources to learn about the process and get example statements was incredibly useful.
I would 100% agree with Maggie that leaning on folks who've been through this recently is really useful. When I was a postdoc at Syracuse, the other really useful thing was they had a career services person who was mostly dedicated to working with grad students and postdocs for this. So he was really, really good, and he told me very blatantly what was working and what was not. And having someone that can be honest with you is incredibly important.
Awesome. Sweet. So the next question is about resources, but you guys already answered that. So let's go on to another simple one. How long should these statements be?
I'll say 2 pages is the standard. And perhaps 2 pages for research is the most common that I've seen. And then for teaching or diversity statements, it may be 1 page on those. Even if there's no limit, I would think 2 pages is about as long as a committee member wants to spend reading it when there's 100 applicants. And I'll say the same for cover letters as well. That cover letter, 1 page is lovely. 2nd page is okay with me. A 3rd page, I'm over it.
Yeah, and I would add to Adam's comment as well that if it's not clear in the ad, a lot of ads will sort of spell that out very explicitly, and as Adam alluded to, 2 pages is probably the mode of the distribution. You should feel free, and in fact, I would encourage you strongly to reach out to the search committee member that's listed in the ad, for questions to ask that specific question, because it may just be an oversight. Academics are known for being scatterbrains, and that seems like the kind of thing that might slip attention of getting an ad out. So if it's not clear, then certainly you should feel free to ask.
Sounds good. Okay, so we all know that we'll be applying to more than 1 different institution when we're working on our application. So how much do your research, teaching, and diversity statements change between applications? And a follow-up to that is, how can you tailor your material for each application, and how do you adapt your documents for each position?
Yeah, I'd be happy to sort of start off with this. I'm guessing that this is one where the panel will have a lot of thoughts and input. And I can speak most recently from somebody that's been on the receiving end of a lot of applications. And I would say that it's really important to tailor your statements in meaningful ways to the institutions that you are applying to. So, and there's a couple of different facets to that. One that I think Margaret alluded to in her introduction is that, you know, the criteria of evaluating applicants between, for instance, a primarily undergraduate teaching intensive university or program versus an R1 are going to be very, very different. And there might be a gradient in between. This can differ by department to department. So at universities like Boise State that sort of were historically teaching intensive, but for whom certain departments have moved more into research intensive modes, depending on what department you're applying to, you know, they might be kind of looking for slightly different things. So all of that said, it's really important to spend a bit of time for every position you're applying for, doing a little bit of that sort of contextual, you know, analyzing the context of the program and the department, right? So spend time on the university website, spend time certainly on the department websites, spend time on the department websites that are you know, that may have faculty with whom you might collaborate, right? So if you are, and you know, and hydrology is obviously sort of very interdisciplinary. So if you're going to if you're applying to a geosciences program, you might be looking at, okay, who's in civil that's doing water, who's in biology that's maybe doing, you know, ecology kind of things. And then the other thing that I would say as well, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this is in the subsequent questions, but almost, well, a lot of universities in this day and age have something that combines the word center, teaching, and learning somewhere in their name, right? And we can talk more about that, but that is going to be an exceptionally important resource for how you might adapt your teaching statement in particular.
Yeah, I would add to that I would really look at the job announcement on a search committee last year, and that job announcement is a legal document. So make sure that you're addressing the things that they're asking for. If they're asking for something specific, make sure that you answer that, because we went with a rubric, ticked off things, and we ranked people based upon how they addressed those very specific things that we asked for. If they didn't hit them, whether we liked them or not, like legally, we couldn't even like sort of move forward with them. It would have, you know, been a big issue. And so like, as you're thinking about your teaching, your diversity, your research statements, really read the words that were put in there. People don't like come up with these job announcements willy-nilly. Like there's a lot of thought that goes into them. Sometimes you regret the way that you wrote things afterwards, but you're sort of stuck with it. So you do need to really answer the question the way that it was asked, because that's where we're gonna
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm gonna do one more question on general statements, and then we can kind of move into the different specific statements. So this kind of a good transition question. Should I put equal weight or effort into all of these statements, or is one more important than the other one? And which one is that, if so?
I think Leho touched on this a little bit already, and I think it's really important to keep in mind what institution you're applying for and what they value. So thinking about a teaching institution's values versus an R1 institution's values, they're probably going to approach reviewing applications really differently. The teaching institution might focus on the teaching statement, and the R1 institution might at least focus initially on the research statement. And so I think echoing what Leho already said, just be aware of each institution's values and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, And I'll add not a counterpoint, but a complementary point, which is just because you're applying to an R1, that doesn't mean people only care about research. And a primarily undergrad institution may be hiring in hopes of expanding their research portfolio or sustaining the involvement of undergraduates in research. So in other words, you better not think of any of those as a gimme, because a person on the committee may have asked a very specific question when they were seeking your teaching statement, and that person's going to have a lot of power over who gets through to the next step, whether or not that appears externally to be the profile of the institution. Unfortunately, perhaps my answer is best foot forward across the board. You don't get any time off on any statement.
I would also add to that I applied mostly to research type schools when I was applying. I found the research statement relatively easy to write, sort of where my brain had been for a long time. I will say I spent a lot more time on the diversity statement than I did on either of the other two. I went through way more drafts of that. I went through way more feedback from other folks. I learned a lot. It was a really good learning experience. Don't take it for granted. Don't take any of those for granted. People really care.
Sounds good. How much should I focus on when researching to research statements now? How much should I focus on my past research versus future research that I plan to do when specifically talking about that research statement? And one kind of comment on that too is like, how do I get out of that PhD mode? I did this as a part of my PhD versus this is what I will do as an assistant professor.
This is a great question, and I would say that from the perspective of somebody who's been on a lot of search committees, I think that it's important to demonstrate your bona fides. At the same time, you will be submitting a CV, right? And you will be getting kind of reference letters, or you'll be listing references of people that can attest to all of these facets. It's important to provide the way that I would look at this, or the lens through which I would look at this, is it's important to maybe contextualize in your research statement how your previous research has turned you into the scholar, the researcher that you are now, and how that sets a good foundation for sort of where you want to go. And so whether that means that you want to start pivoting into an area that is not sort of where maybe is a couple of steps removed from where you're at or where you've been, it's important to sort of say, these are the skills that I learned, or these are the connections that I've made that will help prepare me to move in that direction. And so if you adopt that sort of perspective, right, then there's a natural way, or there's at least, maybe not natural, but there are ways to tie those two elements together, right? And so I think that's the really important thing. That said, and I think reviewers will look at research statements differently. I think one of the big things that I'm looking for as a reviewer is, how is this person going to fit in the landscape of our department and our program, right? What, where are they going to sort of bring together, new collaborations or new ideas? Where do they kind of add value by kind of being the spark that connects a couple of, different researchers? What perspectives can they bring that are different from those perspectives that we already have? So it is important to sort of provide that vision of, what you are going to look like if you were a faculty member that was going to join the faculty at Boise State, for instance.
And I have a kind of a follow-up to that. I really like that answer. But I guess when you're talking about your actual, the statements, how do you balance communicating that you're confident in doing a particular research that you actually haven't done yet. So let's say, you finish your PhD and you're confident, I have these skills to go do this type of question, but there's nothing in my background that says I've actually ever done it. How do you write that?
That's an absolutely great question, right? And I think a lot of that is about, so one of the things that's hardest to sort of assess in any statement, whether, is this idea of sort of self-awareness, right? Like, to what extent can you, right? It's right. Like, we don't want you to sort of exude kind of overconfidence, right? And I think that that's what you're sort of alluding to. So I think that, maybe sprinkling in there some very concrete things that you might do and at the very beginning to sort of promote your professional development, that would indicate that you understand that you're not, you've laid out where you want to go, you understand where you are, and you maybe can identify the first couple of steps to get on that path, right? Whether that's, hey, I noticed that, for instance, I looked into it, and the Idaho Space Grant Consortium has these seed grants. And although I'm, not in remote sensing, I would love to collaborate with so-and-so in this other department to submit a seed proposal to do, some early work that would get me on that path. So I think doing things like that, right, both give that vision of like, okay, how is this person going to fit in, but also address some of those things that are like, yeah, this person is wanting to move in a new direction, and they're sort of demonstrating that they understand the early steps of what they'd need to do to get there.
Yeah, I mean, one easy way to sort of pitch that too would be, here's where I've come from. Here are the logical next steps, because those are the low-hanging fruit in terms of getting funding, right? You're at the cutting edge of research to finish your degree. There's an easy next step, and it would be strange to not have a logical continuation. And then you might say, additionally, there's a related direction that I intend to go in, and I will build these skills, or I'll use my clean lab stable isotopes of nickel skills to next study, I don't know, unstable isotopes of strontium or something, right? Like, help me see why it's a logical parallel as opposed to a hard left turn that has nothing to do with what you've been up to.
Yeah, I'll build off of that. That's exactly how I structured my research statement. So I think it was maybe 1/3 past experiences, 2/3 future experiences. And in the past experiences section, I really focused on my fundamentals. So I marketed myself as a field hydrologist. And so I focused on demonstrating why I am an exceptional field hydrologist. And then for the future portion, I started at the closest link to my current research. And I demonstrated how I might be able to expand with the next step or the lowest hanging fruit. And then from there, I built on to more like, okay, what can I then do in 5 years or beyond that as I build my program at the potential new institution. So I think having some sort of logical progression of ideas from what your past expertise is into your dream expertise makes a lot of sense.
I saw Margaret, you gulp when you said a really good research, whatever. Like, we do need to market ourselves. Own that you're really good at this, and if you're not going to get hired. And I would only add to what you just said that also work in ways that places where you're going to apply for funding, specific grants that you've looked at. How are you actually going to fund your stuff once you're there? A big part of, especially at R1 universities, you need to justify your existence by bringing in a bunch of overhead. So think about that piece of it.
Sweet. Okay, so I want to go off of a point that we've been talking about. How do you balance your technical skills and expertise and laying that out? And Margaret and some others already touched on it. you do that early. How do you balance that with, well, that's good, all these like really detailed skills, but the big picture, how is that contributing to society and to the why do we care? And how do you fit all of that into a no more than 2-page document? Because I don't want to read 3 pages.
I'm going to say I have the same opinion that I do when you write a research proposal, which is I fully trust that you can operate the models you tell me you can, or that you can run an IC if you tell me there's an IC. I don't really care about the details of your methods. I care about the fundability of your research and if they're big, exciting questions. So unless a job ad says, we seek someone who can run wharf hydro over the continental US, I wouldn't go into a lot of technical detail unless it's really explicit, like the person who runs the clean lab retired and they want a stable isotope person who can run a clean lab, then I would explicitly address it. Otherwise, I would try to stay out of the weeds. I would get people excited about my research. And part of my logic there too is if the department already has a person like you who does the technical things like you, that's great. You're somewhat duplicative. And if they don't, nobody else understands what the heck you're talking about, right? Like when you apply to a geoscience department, you've got to get a paleontologist as excited about your work as the other stable isotope geochemist, right? So they're not going to get excited because you know how to run a version 2.719 LCMSMS coupled to a whatever. They don't know what that means, right? They do know understanding Earth's history and how it functions is important. So I'm definitely a stay high level, stay out of the weeds guy.
Yeah, and just to add to Adam's comment there, the question that some of you might be asking is, well, how do I determine those things? This is a point where, and this is something that's not necessarily done quite as much, when you're a graduate student. Maybe it is, or if it is done, it's because maybe your advisor sort of tells you specifically to do these kinds of things. But go and spend some time at least reviewing the big kind of national academies documents that are out there that are related to our field, right? And so, if you're a remote sensing, if you're into remote sensing and hydrology, you should be familiar with the part of NASA's decadal survey, which came out in 2017, that deals with, if it's snow remote sensing, what does it say about snow remote sensing, and be able to sort of point to some of those things and say, hey, this is, these are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in addressing, and here's how. And one reason that's important, I think, is because, as Adam points out, right, the paleo person is not going to understand what the important questions in hydrologic sciences are, but they may find your questions interesting, and that's an important sort of first step. The next step of like, well, are these the important questions in hydrologic sciences? If you're able to sort of say, well, yes, and here's where I can point to, then it at least sort of demonstrates that you're at least steeped in, or familiar with where to get that information, right? How to stay engaged with what the broader community is interested in addressing at this particular time.
I would only add to that, also read broadly, right? We should always be reading more than we are. Go open up, water resources research if you're a hydrologist, and don't just read the stuff that Google Scholar tells you should be reading. Make sure you're at least skimming the abstracts and seeing what the field is doing, not just what your advisor and your collaborators have been doing.
Awesome, good stuff. We are going to transition a little bit to diversity statements, and this one is obviously, as we all know, they are requesting DI statements more and more. It's something that hasn't been around for that long of a time. We don't really have that many questions on it because there's just so much questions on it, sort of. So, and this is an interesting one that we discussed yesterday or a couple of days ago. How related to the fact that we haven't been seeing the DEI questions, statements, a lot of people have not really been doing DEI work over the past few years, at least explicit DEI work. So how do you balance, the work that you have done or may not have done with what you think you should be doing now and what you might plan to do, and come across as authentic as possible in one statement?
I will first stick my foot in my mouth, and then my other fellow panelists can clean it up. So for me, there's some essential elements here. I think one is that you should really be reflecting on what does diversity, equity, inclusivity, justice mean to you, and what role do you believe that you have in it? I think that you should then address or cover. So that's item one. Item two for me would be show me. So what have you done, right? That doesn't mean that you've had to launch $1 billion international nonprofit. You can have taken some very small steps. When you were a TA, you made sure that there was field equipment available for people who couldn't afford it. You made sure that the person wearing the most red was the note taker instead of letting it fall to the demographic who it might normally fall to, right? So show me you've done it. It doesn't have to be big, but it should be thoughtful and real. And then for me, the third is a forward-looking perspective. What do you anticipate doing at our institution? That might be a chance to bring some of your own ideas. That might be that you have looked up that where you're applying has a chapter of Advocates and Allies, which is a group where male academics in the STEM discipline, male academics get together and work to train ourselves and advocate for women in the academy. Perhaps there's a program that you're really excited about. You see that we have a summer camp that's hosted every year with students from tribal colleges, and you want to participate in that. So tell me that you've thought about it on our campus. And I know this is the one about writing statements, but I think for that plus the interview, the other point for me would to be authentic, because if you're doing the lip service and you're making promises that I don't think you'll keep, or you talk about this in a way that is disingenuous, we can tell. I would rather have an honest person say, I haven't done a lot, but at least I understand the issues and I'm thinking about it, than have somebody tell me, oh, this matters so much to me. I'm so passionate about equity and I've never done anything. I've never chosen to lift a finger. We can see that. So hopefully that helps. Those are sort of my elements that I think you should address. And most importantly of all, I think it needs to be authentic, because that question will get asked on the phone interview. It will be asked when you have an on-campus interview. And if you think you can slide by in text, you cannot look somebody in the eye and lie to them about this. People can tell.
Yeah, those are great thoughts, Adam. And I would follow up that, like, this is a statement. I think, Deon, you pointed out that this is a relatively new statement. There's a lot of understanding in particular, and there's a lot of in the community, at least the discussion on Twitter that Adam and I frequently participate on, right, is like, to what extent should we pushing the work of this onto you graduate students? And so I think there's at least a lot of understanding that, there's a lot of folks out there that haven't, done this yet, and so yeah, you absolutely should not be overselling what you've done already if you haven't done a lot, and that's fine. And yeah, the phrase that I would encourage you to remember, or keep as a mantra when writing the DEI statement, right, is a bias towards action, right? What are those things you're going to do? And you don't need to feel like you need to be lifting these things on your own. I think, as Adam pointed out, identifying programs that exist at the institutions you're applying to and saying this is the kind of entity, right? would love, I know that I've looked at the Institute for Transformative and Inclusive Scholarship at Boise State, and I would love to recruit, I will recruit students through the LSAMP program to fund as undergraduates and engage them in the summer research camp, right? So those things, right? So contextual and motivated and biased towards kind of actually doing things are the really important things in DEI statements.
I think, you know, as a white male, it's a very tough statement to write. And I think that it's tough for everybody, but I think it's something that you really need to struggle with. And if you're not struggling with it and struggling with the right way to say things and struggling with your role in all this, I think it's not going to be a useful statement for anybody, especially it will certainly not help you. I think that you need to really acknowledge your role in this, and you need to not only, you know, sort of show what you've done, but you need to show how what you've done is going to be moving forward. I think when we did a search last year, our text on the job announcement was something in the lines of demonstrate the potential to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion at our college. And we had some excellent people who have clearly done things in the past who didn't show how they were going to do things in the future based upon that. So I think that you need to sort of have those two things and juggle them. And the other part of this is some people in the search committee really just won't care about this. They won't care one way or another. But for those who do, you can so quickly exclude yourself from being considered by not putting effort into this. They will just write you off, and they, in this environment and the way that, you know, we should be acting, that's probably what should be happening. So really give it the time. I think this, again, this is a statement that I spent way more time on than either of the other two pieces.
Sounds good. So similar to a research question that we had, how do you balance past DEI work? I know all of you mentioned what you did and what you plan to do. How do you balance that with what you will do? What are you guys looking for? You know, is it all about he's done a lot but doesn't really have plans for the future, or it's all talk and no past experience? What are you guys looking for?
I'll start and just sort of continue that last point. What you've done in the past is great, but depending upon how that announcement is written, it's only great in so much that shows what you will do in the future and how prepared you are to do things in the future. So if you're going to talk about the past, use that as a foundation for how you can, you already understand some of the problems, you already understand how to address them, you've already done some learning, you've already done some falling on your face. Use that as, you know, a step towards what you will be doing.
Yeah, and I think I structured this statement differently than I structured my other statements, where I had mentioned earlier that for my research statement, I started with the past and then built up into the future. And for this statement, I focused on identifying my goals, or, you know, what I would do at this particular institution. So for example, say I had 3 goals. And then within each of those 3 goals, I leaned on my past experiences to explain why I'm interested in those particular things, what I have done in the past to demonstrate I'm serious about it, and then what I'm actually going to do at the institution, and what sort of, you know, pre-existing resources or support system is there to help support me. And so the structure was a little bit different for this statement than my others, but I think it was in a way necessary to balance that past experience and then the potential or future goals.
One more thing I would add to this that I think Margaret just alluded to, right? When you're doing that goal setting, depending on the nature of your goals and just in general, and this is what makes it sort of really hard, right? Is paying attention to and trying to figure out what effective diversity practices might look like at that particular institution, because that varies dramatically between institutions and geographies, right? So what is an effective goal at West Virginia, for instance, might be totally inappropriate in Idaho. And it's just a different audience that needs to be addressed, right? And different, and it's part of just the nature with where we're at with respect to, you know, equity, justice, diversity, inclusion. But it is important, right? It's important to know that you've at least done a little bit of surveying the landscape of that particular institution, and kind of can surmise or put together, you know, what the effective things, or what effective goals might be.
Awesome. I have one more DI question, at least one more, before we move into teaching statements. And you know, Chris sort of kind of touched on this when he mentioned you got to really struggle with it. You know, would the search committee be looking for someone who they think really understands the issue? Because for many people, they're not necessarily trained on this. So you want somebody who can like speak eloquently on the actual issue or issues at hand, or is it just as important to show that you may not be an expert on the subject, but you're at least enthusiastic and you want to try and you want to learn and get there? What are your takes on that?
I think it's going to depend upon the committee member, and it's going to depend upon the way that the job announcement is written. So again, read the document, try and address what they're looking for. Also, when you're thinking about who you're writing to, I mean, think back to what Alejandro was saying, that, you know, you're writing for different geographic locations, and that can be really difficult. If you're applying to West Virginia, for instance, we have all sorts of different kinds of diversity in this state. It's very, very white, and we have a lot of very, very poor rural white people. And so one of the most effective diversity statements I saw was somebody who focused on that population and how they would address that population. I don't know that would have been particularly well received by every committee member. So you are rolling the dice, you are gambling. I saw in another question in there that, you know, there's a question about, am I rolling the dice? Yeah, you're always rolling the dice, especially in the diversity statement. I think the number one thing that I did when I wrote mine was I was honest with myself, and I felt like what I wrote was true. And I could have a conversation about it when I went and interviewed.
Okay, let's keep on schedule, and we can, just as a reminder, breakout rooms, we can talk a lot more about these questions later. So we'll do the last 15 minutes on teaching statements, and we got our first one is, oh yeah, a big one. How do I write a teaching statement if I have little to no teaching or TA experience?
We're all smiling and nodding because we've been in that exact situation. So I think that, right, your teaching statement is not just a list of things you've done. So most teaching statements will include something about your teaching philosophy. So how do you think students learn? How do you manage a classroom? Are you a person who likes to show them things in the field and then backfill it with theory, or the opposite? So I think there's always, it's the norm would be to have something of a teaching philosophy, which is more like how you approach or how you will approach teaching. That doesn't require that you have done so. That requires you have reflected on it. I think early statements, when I didn't have much teaching experience, I reflected on things that I had felt were successful as a student that I would like to bring to my classroom. Because right, what you're showing me is that you've thought about teaching and you have a plan for it. If you have experience, it's great to say, and I implemented that when I TA'd fluid mechanics lab. But I'm not so stressed that you've done it as that you've thought about it, because a lot of people can TA a fluid mechanics lab and have very little practical teaching experience, and have not reflected on it at all. And I think the other note I would simply have is that if you are approaching the end of your PhD, or if you're in a postdoc right now and you don't have teaching experience, some easy ways to work on this, or to help shore that up so you can write that paragraph that says, here's a thing I've done. You could work with your supervisor or another faculty member and say, I'd love to teach a module in your class. Margaret, I know that you're going to spend 3 weeks on stream hydraulics. Can I teach that as a module and have you work with me and help me? Then I can write about it in my statement. And or many campuses will have centers for teaching and learning where you can go to some ad hoc training. And at least then you can say, hey, I'm a regular attendee at the Thursday pedagogy brown bag, and I've been learning best practices, right? So show me that you're making some efforts or trying to get that experience. To me, that's more important than taking, like, you could have taught 8 classes and been horrible at it, or taught 0 classes and have reflected meaningfully. I'd rather have the 0 class person.
Yeah, I'll follow that up with, I think if there's some important things to know and understand at this point that I maybe didn't understand, right? It's that the scholarship of teaching and learning itself is a whole field. It's a whole intellectual discipline, right? And those folks do research on folks, that are in our classes to understand what works and what doesn't. Often it's the job of the Centers for Teaching and Learning at our universities to distill that into, here are effective practices for design. So knowing that there are evidence-based practices for designing classes, knowing and communicating in your statement that either you've started to engage with that, as Adam said. I'm guessing all teaching and learning centers are open to graduate students and postdocs, right? It's, so showing up at those seminars, participating in workshops here and there on instructional design, those are really effective things, because that tells me that, hey, this person's at least been enlightened to the idea that there are effective ways of designing classes, and even if they don't have the teaching experience, they don't have the experience, they've at least become, again, kind of self-aware that this is a craft and this is something they need to work on, and they're telling me that they know where on our campus they will be able to find that, and how they would infuse that into the courses that they plan to teach.
I also just want to add to this great discussion by saying that there are many different flavors of teaching. And so maybe you haven't TA'd a lot, or maybe the TAing has been minimal. There are other ways that you can get teaching experience outside of the classroom. So for example, if you had a summer field assistant during your research experience, or you had an opportunity to mentor someone, that is a really great example of a teaching experience. And so one thing that I definitely made sure I included in my teaching statements is my mentoring philosophy. I think your opportunity to mentor your lab group or students in your department is equally as important as being in a classroom. And so allowing yourself time in your teaching statement to talk about what your mentoring philosophy is also really important.
Okay. We've got one more teaching statement question, and then we have a couple fun ones at the end. Chris, I'm looking at you because I know you've had experience to this. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but anyone feel free to answer this. How do we incorporate what students taught of the course we taught as a TA, into the application material? Is a teaching assessment the best place to highlight what students think about teaching? And I know I mentioned Chris, but you guys, anyone answer?
Well, I'll jump in there first. I think a teaching statement can be the ideal place to incorporate this in there if you do it smartly. If you do it the wrong way, it will look sloppy and thrown in there. So be careful about how you say it. I structured my teaching statement with 3 quotes. I did a lot of teaching before. I think I TA'd like 11 courses as a grad student, and then I taught 4 classes during my postdoc as teacher of record. So I had a lot of recommendations. I know Margaret's like looking at me like I'm crazy. But I had a lot of evaluations I could draw on and some really good quotes that I thought spoke to my philosophy as a teacher. So instead of explicitly spelling out my philosophy, I could use those quotes as sort of my hook. And that also worked really well, not just because I then used that quote, but it also, if you're on a search committee and you're reading 50 to 100 or more applications, anything you can do to break up that black block of text is really important. So I ended up using 3 quotes to spell out 3 different pieces of my teaching philosophy. And I put those in italics and sort of put the teaching philosophy behind it, and it really made it more legible. And that was the only, of my 3 statements, that was the only one that I was happy with at the end, because of sort of how it came together.
Okay. Well, we have an interesting question from the audience. Let me just read this out here. So I'm hearing a lot of advice and opinions from the panelists that is essentially the opposite of what I've heard from others who have been on search committees and advise me on my applications. It feels like I'm just rolling the dice every time I revise my statements and decide which pieces of advice to follow. Could you comment on the distribution of expectations that search committee members might have when they review applications?
Big. They're going to have a wide range of thoughts and expectations, and you're trying to hit the median. You're going to fall short or throw that ball way too far for a given person on every single search committee, probably. Be careful when you interview. Like, one wrong comment, I know one wrong comment like threw off somebody being hired at one spot because somebody said one thing, and I'm sure that person doesn't even know that that was like a thing that was disqualifying for that interviewer. It's really hard. We're trying to gain an impression of you and an impression of how you would up from a very limited amount of data. And if I'm tired as I'm reading your document, like, it's gonna get pushed to the side. If I'm, I don't know how to answer that other than swing a lot, and eventually you're gonna hit something.
Yeah, I'll add, I think it's a lot like when we attend these seminars about how to write a fundable proposal, right? I mean, it is really a stochastic process. And so with that recognition, maybe my 2 pieces of advice would be, one is, when I'm seeking people's advice, I try to keep asking for advice until I'm only hearing the same things over and over and over. So you've heard the full gamut, and then you can just pick which ones to ignore. Right? But at least you won't be blindsided. You're going to ignore some things, or you're going to say, hey, my advisor knows how to get a job in a physics department, and this goofball Adam has never done that. Why would I listen to him? I should listen to my advisor. That's good, right? Because you've now heard 2 opinions and you're choosing. So that's number 1. Get a lot of advice, and then you can pick which ones to ignore. Number 2 would be, I think that you are burning a lot of effort if you revise your statements whole cloth every time. You want to work on the best way to present yourself, your potential as a researcher, your potential as an instructor, your potential to address some of the systemic DEI problems in our field and on our campuses. And how you present yourself is a reflection of you. right? We don't all wear the same outfit when we go on a first date. We present ourselves in a way that we choose, right? That is how your materials come off. They're a reflection of you. So my template with your name pasted in isn't going to work for you. So I think the question is, how do you efficiently and effectively present who you are, what your potential is? And when you feel good about that, you're showing it to advisors, you're getting feedback from colleagues. I wouldn't then go, oh, there's a job opening at, I don't know, Boise State instead of State of Boise. I should start from blank paper again, right? I would start with what you were proud of and then try to tailor it, as opposed to the stress and pressure of rewriting.
I think that's right. And I would just, there's a whole other set of webinars that's probably exceptionally boring, right? Which is perhaps how these search committees are ultimately formed, right? And how they operate. And right, I think that what you have to understand is that everybody, you know, there's usually kind of one chair of a search committee who's kind of taking the lead. And then truthfully, just because there's more things to do than there are people to do it at most institutions, you know, some of those search committee chairs just happen to be the kind of people that, you know, whose service obligations could fit in serving on the search committee, right? And they may be igneous petrologists, right? And you know, so it is that's sort of just to sort of underscore some of this stochasticity, right? That you know, you can't control the composition of the search committees. You can't control their biases that they bring to, you know, implicit and explicit, unfortunately, that they might bring to particular job ads. As Adam is kind of underscoring, you can control what's in these statements, right, and in your letter, and who your references are. And, you know, just work hard on those things. And yeah, keep at it. And I think Adam's point is really salient, that that when you're happy with them, you know, that's kind of the best you could do. There's a whole bunch of things that at the end of the day you just can't control.
Okay, thank you. I guess on, you know, behalf of HRF and CUAHSI, I want to thank the panelists for this Q&A session, and thank you guys for all your questions. I do want to emphasize we do have part 2. I know there's a ton of questions we didn't get a chance to answer yet, but please stick around for part 2. There's a link in the chat going around, so make sure you click on that link before we close this seminar. We're going to do a 5-minute break, and we will start the breakout room session at 1:05 Eastern time.